Welcome to another Coffee with the Alchemist. Today, we have the honor of having a real pioneer in the realm of biohacking and longevity. He is the author of the mitochondrial free radical theory of aging and co author of Ending Aging. He is generally recognized as one of the world's leading experts in longevity research, a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America, the American Antiaging Association, and also the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He has a BA in computer science, studies in bioinformatics, and a PhD in biology from University of Cambridge. Dr. Aubrey De Grey is the president and CSO at the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation and co-founder at the SENSE Research Foundation. Join us as we dip into the fascinating world of longevity science with Aubrey De Grey. In this episode, we will explore the latest about rejuvenation therapy, the future of aging research, and the profound implications from human health and longevity. Among the topics you will see in the show notes, we managed to cover quite a lot. From the reason why Aubrey is not a piano player, to the role of Mrs., to the mitochondrial free radical theory of aging, diving deep into the mechanism and functions of the recent drugs on longevity and research, including rapamycin, NMN, and many, many others. We will finally dive deep on the Longevity Summit and the work Aubrey is currently doing. So, without further ado, dear listeners, let's welcome to the show Dr. Aubrey De Grey.
A small book of questions, but I don't know. Let's go, and we'll let them tell. So I really thank you, and I start sharing with this thing we have in common. We are born on the same day, so April 20th, just a few years apart. And I want to start with a curiosity about you, is because I heard somewhere that you 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 are a potential piano player, right?
A potential what?
Piano player.
Not at all, no. No. So I think I know what you are referring to. When I was very young, when I was like 8 years old, my mother wanted me to practice the piano. And I have told this story a few times publicly, so that's why I think you have probably heard about it. Um, the thing is that I did not want to. I was reluctant and resistant to this. Um, but somehow or other, I already had a great desire to understand things, including understanding myself. So I thought about the question, why do I not want to practice the piano? And I realized pretty quickly that the answer was not the obvious one. The answer was that the best possible outcome result of practicing would be that I would become a good pianist. And I immediately realized that, that wasn't good enough, that, there are already plenty of good pianists. So, I would not be making much of a difference to the world. And that was the first time when I realized that making a difference to the world is how I wanted to spend my life and my time. And over the next, decade or so, that gradually, crystallized. I realized that I definitely didn't ever want to have kids because kids are something that's very time consuming, and yet a lot of other people are perfectly good at having them. And I also realized that I wanted to be a scientist of one sort or another, because scientists are the people who make the most difference to the world in the long run. And so eventually I decided I wanted to go into artificial intelligence research because I found when I was 15 and I started writing software, I found that I was pretty good at it. So I thought I'll do that. And then in my late 20s, I found out that, in fact, there was a much more important problem to work on, namely the biology of aging. Um, I had previously always known that it was a more important problem than any other, but I had not known that nobody else was really working on it, that people had basically given up. So I thought that won't do, so I switched fields.
Well, that's great because things is in the you mentioned in the late 20s, you got the late last, but well, you have done in the 20 years plus something what people are not doing in 80. So you have to do this self-reflection and these changes in your life that are very remarkable. So this is that's great. So and then finally we are at today's, oh no, not today's, yeah, 1999, and then your book with the co-author and engaging is, I think, is 2007. So it's already a few years now. So well, I start with this question. So what has changed, or if so many things has changed from the end engaging, the major changes that, I mean, new edition will fix. I mean,
Right. Um, Masses and masses has changed. But the great thing, and the main reason why I have not written a second book like that, is because nothing big has changed in terms of the nature of the problem and the kinds of solutions that we could come up with. The progress that has been made has all been within the framework that I set out back then. So now we have, for each of these 7 different types of damage, we have more than one approach to fixing it. Whereas back in the 20 years ago, we only had one way for each of them. And that's great. It means that we have a better chance of succeeding more quickly than we otherwise would. But we have not had to, like, add another category, category number 8, or rethink any of the approaches that were previously looking plausible. So that's really great news. Now, of course, there might be a case for me writing an update anyway, but it takes a long time to write a book, so I've had other priorities.
that's a very good. Yeah, indeed, this is linked to human biology and humanity and human being, which is not easy to. I mean, we are talking about 20 years, which seems a lot, but it's nothing compared with the human biology. And so, and I start linking. So for sure, nothing has changed in terms of definition of aging, which I just mentioning here. So it's the lifelong accumulation of damage to the tissues, cells, and molecules of the body that occurs as an intrinsic side effect of the body normal operation, which are the keywords, are the intrinsic side effect of the body, the
Yeah.
normal operation. Yes, because, and then we go to your theory and what is in your book. So just for our listeners, because we have plenty of YouTube video where you show a lot of slides. I have a few here just for backup, but um, is so you mentioned that nothing has changed about the 7 deadly thing, but your approach to aging is about this intrinsic side effects. So instead of looking at the complexity of the human biology, all the mechanisms inside, metabolism, etc., so you said, okay, this is going. If you touch, and this is something I see in the biohacking community, if you tweak something or you want to intervene in such a complex system, this is the butterfly effect, let's say, is you never know. So that's why you focus more on the, so this is happening, damage is happening, so let's focus on maintenance. So can you please summarize this switch or shift of view?
Yeah, sure. So you have it exactly right. The body is a machine, but it's an extraordinarily complicated machine, which means that if we try to adjust the way it works, then we will have unintended consequences. And it's very difficult to communicate how bad this problem is. How insanely complicated the human body is, and how little we know about how it works. And that realization that the body is just so complicated that we can't tweak it is really the main reason why, by the 1970s and 1980s, people in the biology of aging had basically given up on the idea of ever doing anything about aging. But that's because they were not thinking like engineers. They were thinking like basic scientists who try to understand things just for the sake of understanding them. And because of that, they overlooked the fact that the machine that we are working with is still a machine. In other words, its function is determined by its structure, by its composition. And therefore, the only reason that we start to function less well when we are old is because our bodies have a different composition as time goes on. And of course, the reason they have a different composition is because of these side effects, the changes that happen to what the body's made of as a result of the body's normal operation throughout life. Now, this was not something that anyone really disputed. They just weren't thinking about it in that way because they didn't see any reason to think about it that way. And the reason, of course, is that when you are thinking about a machine in this way, you can sidestep your ignorance of how the machine works. The key thing about the human body and about any machine, really, any machine with moving parts, is yes, it accumulates damage, but the machine is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage without any significant decline in function. It's only when there's more than that threshold amount that we start to see problems. So that means, taking the next step, that means that these changes that are happening to the body throughout most of life before they have become problematic, they are not really participating in metabolism. They are side effects that are harmless, they are inert. And that means that if we try to reverse those changes, to repair that damage, then we will be doing it without interfering in this network of processes that we don't understand. We can let metabolism carry on creating damage at the normal rate because we will be repairing the damage after metabolism has created it, though before there is so much damage that we get sick. And because we are doing it then, we are essentially doing, as you say, preventative maintenance. We are not interfering in how the body works, and therefore we have a much better chance of success.
Well, great. Yeah, I'm an engineer, so I fully understand. At the end of the aging definition, the body can tolerate some damage, but too much of it goes to disease and disability. So, and this is linked to what you mentioned. And my question is now going to my question coming from reading the book, the role of hormetic stressors in this picture, because hormetic stressors, you produce stress, and then we link with the mitochondrial mutation, etc. But yeah, this is another point. So the role of hormesis in this picture, how does it work? Because we are stressing the body. So how does it work?
Hormesis doesn't really figure in this. Hormesis is the phenomenon where the body responds in a way that it already knows how to do without any medicine, right? Responds to a stress. And the reason that hormesis is interesting is because very often when the body is responding to a stress that is temporary, like an infection, for example, the body continues that response, it maintains that response after the stress has gone away. So that thereafter it is, if you like, protecting itself unnecessarily well. Now, of course, it's not really unnecessary. If we think about it from an evolutionary perspective, what the body is doing there is simply optimizing for future events, because any stress that has happened once is more likely to happen a second time than a stress that has not happened once, right? So we can think of the adaptive immune system as an example of hormesis, though it's not normally described as one, but it should be. Because what's happening in the adaptive immune system is that you have cells called naive cells, naive T cells and B cells, which are able to react to a huge range of potential infections and other threats. And they do, but they are rather slow to do so. They have to figure out how to react. And then, the specific, very teeny tiny minority of cells that are what's called cognate for the infection, in other words, that are appropriately arranged so that they can fight the infection, they expand to large numbers, they get rid of the infection. But the hormetic part, the adaptive part, is that after the infection has been defeated, the cells don't just go away. Most of them go away, but some of them are retained as what are called memory cells. And so if you get the same infection a second time, years later, then the response of the immune system is much more rapid than it was the first time round, because these memory cells, they remember what to do, and they are configured to expand and respond much more quickly. So you get rid of the second time, you get rid of the infection much more easily and much more rapidly than you did the first time.
That's interesting, because my curiosity is more about that. Let's go back to the mitochondrial, the survival of the slowest, I think,
Right.
model. Yeah. So, if correct me if I'm wrong, but this is very simplistic way. So I invite everyone to read the book, because it's not technical, or it's like it reads very very nicely. So is a mitochondria. You mentioned there are some mutations that is a sort of self protection from death, from mitochondria. So they protect themselves, not producing, so surviving, so not doing the oxidative phosphorylation cycle, basically, not doing the damage to themselves, producing free radicals, and then these remain. They remain there. There are other that are more active, that working perfectly, but they produce some free radical, they produce ATP perfectly working, but they damage themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And for this reason, when we are lysosome, if I'm not wrong, acting, lysosome are acting on the good ones that are deteriorating themselves because they are working. But the lazy ones, let's say called lazy, the one that they're not producing ATP and they are there, survive. So in the end, we have cycles that the slowest one are replicating and with the same defects and DNA defects, and so we have a multitude of these mutations that they are doing nothing, and in the end you have the cell which is surviving only because with a minimum amount of ATP from glycolysis. And you have somewhere in the books something about electrons that are going out because of NAD and ADH cycle. It needs to be there. And the electrons are then damaging potentially LDL, and this is the cascade thing. So I'm really summarizing, I don't know how many pages of this book in a few words. In this, is this thing valid? And then when I talk about traumatic stress, like an intense workout, or cold or heat stress, I'm expecting an intense workout is having the good mitochondria to run faster and to damage themselves faster.
Mm-hmm.
Is this right?
Not exactly. So,
Okay.
so everything you said about my model, this survival of the slowest thing, and the second part of it involving what goes on outside the cell, which is called the reductive hotspot hypothesis, all of this is, nicely elegant, but it is still unproven. Nobody really knows whether these hypotheses are correct. There are other hypotheses out there about how mitochondrial mutations matter, how they contribute to eventual decline in function in late life, that are also still not falsified. So we don't yet know whether this model is correct, but I still like it, even though it's nearly 30 years old. Now, the part that I want to correct you on is the hormetic part. So it's actually a curious thing. It's often called the exercise paradox. Why exercise is not bad for you. Why it doesn't seem to shorten life. Because, as you say, exercise involves using more calories, creating more ATP, doing more electron transport. But we have actually understood for a long time why this is not bad for you. The answer is that mitochondrial electron transport has a very nonlinear relationship to free radical generation. The remarkable thing is that when a mitochondrion is working well, pushing electrons along the chain fast and making a lot of ATP, it doesn't make many free radicals. The most dangerous mitochondria, the ones that make the most free radicals, are ones that are not being used as much as they could be. In other words, they are not making much ATP. Now, of course, the amount of ATP you make depends on how much ATP you are consuming. So it depends on the availability of ADP, right? Among other things. So an extreme example of this is when you have an athlete, someone who's using a lot of energy over a long period of time, and then they abruptly stop doing so. They stop training, for example. Then they are not using much energy. And if you like, they have too many mitochondria in their muscles and so on. And the result is these mitochondria are not working they're not making much ATP. And those, as I say, are the ones that make more free radicals. And the detailed mechanics of this, about why that's true, that's pretty well understood now. Okay, so what happens? What happens is that mitochondria get destroyed really quickly. Not just damaged mitochondria, the way that you described a moment ago, but mitochondria in general. The system just goes after mitochondria and gets rid of some of them so that you no longer have this surplus, and the mitochondria that remain will have enough work to do, so they won't make too many free radicals.
Wow. Oh, okay, perfect. Thanks for the clarification. Let's jump back a little bit to another to longevity escape velocity in practice. So there is one slide, I don't know in which presentation, when it is mentioned the first 1,000 years old is probably 10 years younger than the first 150 years old.
Right.
Is this correct? And can you please explain a little bit to summarize this?
Yeah, I very much still believe that that's probably true. Of course, we don't know for certain because it's the future, but yeah, I think it's probably true. The reason is simple. It is that this approach to postponing the health problems of late life, this preventative maintenance, damage repair approach, buys time. What happens is you'll take someone who's already, let's say, 60 years old, or maybe older, and you will repair the damage that they have so that they become, if you like, biologically younger again. And that means that it will be a while before they become biologically the same age that they were when you treated them the first time. Now, during that period, people like me, the scientists, will be continuing to improve the therapies. So if you think about, okay, why does somebody need the therapies to be improved? The answer is because the therapies will not be perfect. If you take someone who's 60 and you rejuvenate them back to biologically 40, one has to ask, okay, why aren't you rejuvenating them back to biologically 20? And the answer is because the therapies don't work on everything. The damage that accumulates in the body throughout life comes in many different forms, and some of those forms are inherently more difficult to repair than others. So the first generation damage repair therapies will repair, let's call it the easy damage, but not the difficult damage. We can use that as the definition of the distinction between easy and difficult, right? Mm-hmm. So then 20 years later, when your 60-year-old is now 80 and they're back to biologically 40, they won't really be back to biologically 60. They won't be really biologically 60 because they won't have any easy damage. They'll only have difficult damage. Right? Because the easy damage you can repair as often as you like. So that means that if we just carry on using the same medicines, the same damage repair, then it's not going to have any effect. You know, the person's going to carry on getting older. They'll get older more slowly than they otherwise would because they won't have any easy damage, but they'll still get older and sick and eventually die. That won't do. So, of course, the goal is then to figure out how to fix that. And of course, we've had 20 years, right? So we will have been able to improve the therapy so that some, not all, but some of the difficult damage will have become easy. It will have become repairable. So that means we will be able to rejuvenate the same people when they are 80 with the amount of damage that they had when they were 60, even though that damage is inherently more difficult to repair. So that means we can give them another 20 or 30 years and so on. And that's what longevity escape velocity is all about. It's staying one step ahead of the problem. Now, what that means in terms of lifespan, well, you quoted this one way in which I say this. There are many other ways to say it. But if we ask, okay, how soon are we going to get someone aged 150? Well, it's certainly not going to happen anytime soon because people take a while to get to that. But the people who are going to get there, the first people who are going to get there, are people who would naturally live to, let's say, 110. You know, the oldest people who can live to 110 without this medicine. So those people tend to get to 110, not by surviving in a very bad state of health for a long, long time, but rather by staying healthy for a long, long time. So they will be biologically 60 only when they're like 85 or something like that, right? In terms of the amount of damage they have in their body. So we take those people, let's say someone's 85 when these therapies come along, we can still rejuvenate them by 20 years because they've still got 20 years left in them, right? So they're not at death's door. And that means that we've got a chance of getting them out to 150. But we might not quite catch up. We might not quite be able to, to do this. However, it's going to be tight. Someone who's 75, right, will have much, much better chance of making the cut, of making it to longevity escape velocity, and letting science, letting the medical research stay one step ahead of the problem. And if you do that, then an age of 1,000 is easy to get to, because you can look at today's mortality rates, your risk of death when you're not dying from aging, right? You can say, well, okay, so supposing someone gets to the age of 26, right? They're not going to die of aging anytime soon. So what is their chance in the Western world today of not getting to the age of 27? And the answer is less than 1 in 1,000. So if you keep that same probability per year, right, however long ago you were born, then, that gives you 4-digit lifespans. And, that's the only difference. At the moment, every year that goes by during adult life, you are 10% more likely to die that year than you were the previous year, right? If we get rid of that 10%, then 1,000 years old is just an inevitable mathematical consequence. And it scares the living daylights out of people when we talk about this, when we point this out, but it shouldn't. First of all, it's just math. You can't argue with it. And secondly, what's wrong with staying alive, if you're healthy?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. I'm fully to do so. You mentioned that this easy and complex or difficult to tell. And at this moment, before talking about lab intervention or something more advanced, what do you think in practice? Diet, exercise, nutrition, the exercise, light exposure, sleep.
Mhm.
These are normal. We don't know lab intervention. What do you think is in order the most impactful one and in the least? Yeah.
Right. So, of course, the only way to answer that question is to subdivide it into two questions, really, a short-term one and a long-term one. I work on the long term. I'm interested in developing the early stage research to identify ways to get to longevity escape velocity, to actually, repair damage comprehensively. We don't have that today. So if you want to do something today to extend your healthy lifespan and therefore your total lifespan, then you've got to try, less effective measures. And the less effective measures that are available right now pretty much all revolve around famine. They revolve around somehow or other not eating as much as you would like, or tricking the body into thinking you're not eating as much as you would like, even when you actually are, things like that. And what that's all about is, why that's useful is because it has been useful evolutionarily. It has been a case of famines happen in the real world, and therefore evolution has had the motivation, the pressure to develop ways to optimize. Now, you have to ask then, okay, what optimization is needed? The answer is pretty straightforward. If you're in a famine, then there's not much point in having offspring, because those offspring will die of starvation before they can have their own offspring. So it's evolutionarily more advantageous to hunker down and do your best to survive the famine. So it's a kind of changing of metabolic priorities, right? You can put energy into maintenance, or you can put energy into growth and reproduction. Now, that's all very well, and sure enough, it translates into what we would predict. Animals that are given less food than they would like live longer than ones that are given as much food as they would like. But here's the rather irritating detail. Animals that have a longer natural lifespan get less of a benefit of this sort. If you're a mouse, and we do this, or a rat, normally lives a couple of years, right? Then we can get maybe 50% increase in lifespan if you put them in a suitably diminished calorie state for their whole lives. Less than that if you start late in life, if you start in middle age, but you can still get maybe 10 or 15%, not so bad. However, if you do the equivalent experiment with longer lived species like dogs, for example, which has been done, then you get much less. Like if you do it with dogs for their whole life, you only get about 10% increase in lifespan rather than 50%. If you do it with monkeys, you might get a couple of percent if you're lucky. Conversely, if you go down to really short-lived organisms like nematode worms, you can multiply them by 5, by a factor of 5, right? Just by this kind of approach. So we have to ask, why is that true? And actually, it's pretty easy. Again, it comes down to looking at the evolutionary selective pressure. It's simply that long famines are less common in the real world, in nature, than short famines, which means that the selective pressure to optimize for long famines isn't there. So we just have an inherently weaker response to famine than what short-lived species like mice or rats do. And the same thing applies to these things called calorie restriction mimetics, that are drugs that trick the body into thinking it's in a famine when it isn't, right? Because, of course, they are activating the same pathways, the same change in metabolic priorities that actual famine does. So you could never expect to have a more extreme effect from a calorie restriction mimetic than you would get from calorie restriction itself. All right, so this is all rather unfortunate. But first of all, even a couple of years of increase in lifespan is better than nothing. No, you're not going to get, I don't believe you're going to get anywhere near a couple of years unless you start early in life. Not if you start at age 50 or 60. But still, even 6 months is better than nothing. Plus, it probably makes you healthier, especially in the modern world. In the modern world, of course, most of us don't treat ourselves very well. And we are, sometimes overweight and so on. Calorie restriction there, or calorie restriction mimetics, may have a considerably more significant effect on healthy lifespan, even if it doesn't really extend total lifespan very much. And so, I'm definitely in support of these things. But one always has to take into account the logic I've just outlined, which tells you that this is not and never will be the Holy Grail. It will never get us to longevity escape velocity.
Great. Yeah, perfect. I fully understand. Yeah, and the calorie restriction, and we know that people in extreme calorie deficit, they have issues with reproductive systems. It is perfectly in line. So there are issues with the. And then you mentioned that the drugs are, I think you're referring to metformin, rapamycin. These are mimetics. I think also spermidine is as well, and all only in the same space. And I have a quick ones on other that are okay. One is NMN, but I think I don't know if this is acting the same way, and other are less common. But what NMN is acting the same way, or is
Right, so all of the ones that you just mentioned, rapamycin, metformin, NMN, these work in different ways. And in fact, we believe that most of them work in multiple ways. So I'm just going to abbreviate. But they are all, the main ways in which they work are all, one way or another, stopping the body from using calories the way it normally does. Rapamycin is a bit of an exception because what rapamycin does is it has an impact on protein synthesis. So rather than actually calories that are missing, it's amino acids that are missing. Basically you're not getting enough. We make most of our amino acids from proteins that we eat. Some of them we synthesize from other amino acids, but there are things called essential amino acids where we can't do that. So yeah, you need proteins, you need amino acids in order to make new proteins. And the mechanism of rapamycin is to slow down the creation of new proteins, which is equivalent from the point of view of what the body sees to not having enough amino acids to make the proteins from in the first place. Metformin works by slowing down the respiratory chain, the electron transport chain that you talked about earlier. In particular, it inhibits complex 1, which is the first part. And that, again, it's as if we're not getting enough calories, because complex 1 gets its electrons indirectly, mostly from sugar and also from fatty acids. NAD is a slightly more complicated case. So NMN is a precursor of NAD, right? It is absorbed better than NAD, and it is then converted into NAD in the body. And the same is true for the other NAD precursor that's popular these days, NR, nicotinamide riboside. Okay, so what's going on there is you're increasing the amount of NAD that's available in the cell. Why would that look like calorie restriction? The answer is that NAD is a kind of reservoir. What happens is that each molecule of NAD either has or does not have 2 electrons that it carries around, and it gets those electrons from some places like glycolysis or whatever, or the Krebs cycle, and it gives them to complex 1. And so basically, if you've got more NAD and you're doing the same amount of glycolysis and so on, then still the total amount of electrons in the NAD reservoir is the same. So the proportion of the reservoir that is occupied is smaller because the reservoir is bigger, right? Now, that's the kind of thing that the body senses. It doesn't sense absolute amounts of things, it senses proportions of things. So the body looks at its NAD reservoir and it says, it's not as full as it normally is. And that is recognized, interpreted by the body as the body just not having enough electrons in the first place. In other words, not having enough calories. Right. So that's how NAD and its properties work.
This thermostat. There is a thermostat. Yeah, really nice. I didn't know that. That's good point. And I assume berberine is still doing the same, although there is a recent.
Yeah. So all of these other things that appear to have some good effects work in, well, at least it seems they probably work in more or less the same way. But the ones that you've just touched on are the most prominent and the best understood.
Okay, perfect. There are some other that maybe are not directly impacting, but I don't know if it's impacting. It's a carbon C60. And I don't know if what you experience or your how this
So it's still a bit controversial, and it really shouldn't be. The first work that was done on fullerenes in this area was done by a splendid professor named Laura Dugan when she was at UCLA. I had her along to one of my early conferences in probably 2005 or 2007 to talk about it. Fantastic work. And the thing is, it wasn't actually C60 itself. It was C60 with a little bit of chemical modification done to it. A few carboxy groups were attached. And essentially, it works like a super duper antioxidant, something that can soak up electrons really, really well. And that's definitely got value. You want to soak up electrons, especially because C60 is lipophilic, so it tends to go into membranes, whereas most antioxidants don't do that, and the ones that do tend to only work in conjunction with ones that don't. So the classical example would be vitamin E, which works in conjunction with vitamin C. And if you don't have enough vitamin C, then actually vitamin E becomes pro-oxidant, not antioxidant. So C60 is really promising. And then it kind of just got buried and forgotten. And Laura Dugan got some, overly bureaucratic administrative job and wasn't pushing it hard enough. And then some people had a go using regular normal C60, and they mixed it with olive oil, which also has antioxidant properties.
Yeah.
Well, not exactly antioxidant, it's oxidation resistant. And then the results were a bit equivocal. It looked very impressive, but people tried to repeat it and they couldn't really get it to work, and it might have only been the olive oil having the effect and so on. Yeah. But now things are improving. The whole, so Laura has reemerged and is the main scientific founder of a new company that's pushing forward with the original work that she did. And so I'm very hopeful that this will have a new lease of life. I'm quite optimistic.
Perfect. Now that is promising. That's very good. And you were mentioning the lipophilic, hydrophilic, so and I methylene blue.
Methylene blue. Yeah.
Ah,
Okay, that's another curious one.
ah.
It's, again, something that hasn't been looked at nearly enough. Really, only one group up in Scotland had a good look at it several years ago now. I believe it definitely needs more attention. I don't really know how methylene blue works.
So the
Yeah.
last two, quick one are no, two or three. Is one is your opinion on resveratrol?
Resveratrol is a tricky one. Because certainly the early work that was done had some experimental problems. It often happens. It's nothing to be ashamed of. But the early work that was done was somewhat misinterpreted. And when people tried to improve on resveratrol and make chemicals that were similar but worked more powerfully, again, that was, maybe some of it worked, maybe it didn't. GlaxoSmithKline spent a great deal of money trying to make it work by buying Certris and so on. And, it's hard to say. But the mechanism whereby resveratrol may work, insofar as it may, or things like it work, is closely related to the whole business of NAD that I mentioned earlier. And of course, that's why David Sinclair got into NAD, having worked originally with resveratrol. There may be mechanisms relating to the protection of DNA. There's something very important that NAD is used for other than transporting electrons around that I mentioned earlier, which is to do with DNA repair. There's something called poly-ADP ribose polymerase, which is an enzyme that's involved in DNA repair, and it consumes large amounts of NAD. Now, that NAD is recycled afterwards, but still, if you've got damage to your DNA, you don't want this kind of thing going on too much. So there may be some role there. Yeah, it's more complicated.
Yeah, okay. And the last is about water. And there are two. One is very, maybe who is hydrogenated water. Is something that is very, I don't know if you heard about it, if you know about adding hydrogen to water and if it's got some benefits.
Yeah, I don't really believe in any of that.
No.
Changing the pH of water, which is kind of what it's about. Honestly, pH is a very fundamental property of biological fluids, and it's a property that the body works very hard to maintain constant. In fact, a very famous biologist a century ago named J.B.S. Haldane, who was a bit crazy and did self-experimentation to the extreme, he tried to change the pH of his own blood by 1 unit, and he succeeded, but he made him very sick, and he only did it very, very briefly. So don't do that. So people say, alkaline water and alkaline this or that, it might be good for you, but I honestly don't believe a word of it because the body will correct for it very, very quickly.
Yeah. Same. Homeostasis. But alkaline, but the H2 water apparently is adding H2 that is doing something. But the last about things is deuterium water, because you started talking and about deuterium water, I don't know, many years ago, where now quite only recently came to the wider audience. What about yeah.
Okay, so there is a confusion here that I need to correct, because I have never talked about deuterated water at all. I have no real reason to believe that deuterated water has any value.
Okay.
The thing that absolutely does have value is deuterated fatty acids. It may be that deuteration is also valuable for certain other molecules, but the fatty acids are the one that get the big attention right now. And this again comes down to free radicals, because it turns out that fatty acids play a huge part in free radical damage. What happens basically is that certain free radicals can oxidize a fatty acid, and when they do, the fatty acid becomes capable of essentially passing on the oxidation state. And it's worse than that. The reaction is not just a chain reaction, it's a chain reaction that can branch. So you can get multiple different oxidized fatty acids just from one initial event. The chemistry of this has been well understood for many, many years. And it's also why olive oil is good for you, because olive oil, it turns out, does not have the substructure that allows oxidation to happen easily. But it turns out that other fatty acids that do have this substructure, which is called bisallylic carbons, ALLYLIC, they can be protected from oxidation by replacing the particular hydrogens that are linked to those carbons with deuterium. This makes the carbon-hydrogen bond stronger and less oxidizable. And so it turns out that it's possible to make deuterated fatty acids. It's now actually, over the past few years, become very easy. You can make lots and lots of it very cheaply because there's a nice, clever catalytic reaction that was discovered. And these fatty acids, because of this chain reaction thing, can be supplied in the diet, and you don't even need to supply all that much of them. You can give people, or mice or whatever, these fatty acids in perfectly tolerable quantities in their diet, and they accumulate a respectable proportion of deuterated fatty acids in their body, in all of their tissues, and this slows down oxidation. And it appears to have really dramatic effects. So right now, that work is just moving towards clinical trials. It's been in clinical trials already for certain childhood diseases, congenital diseases that are characterized by really high oxidative stress. But I really strongly believe in this technology, and I think it's a tragedy that it's taken so long to hit prime time.
Then Longevity Summit Dublin and the Longevity Declaration. So I heard recently. What is it about?
Okay, first of all, Longevity Summit Dublin. So this is the conference that I run every year in Dublin, of course, in Ireland. It's coming up on June the 13th through 16th this year. Of course, registration is still open. Scientists who want to submit abstracts for presentation at the poster session that's still open as well. Strictly speaking, the deadline has passed, but in fact, I tend to accept things late. And the speaking lineup of it's absolutely stellar as always. I have been running these conferences for more than 20 years now. They started out in Cambridge in England, then they moved to San Francisco, then they moved to Berlin, and now they're in Dublin. They have been very, very effective in promoting ideas, in getting people involved in the field who have gone on to make big contributions. And so I always get really the top speakers, but also I bring in speakers that you haven't heard of, people who don't think of themselves as gerontologists even, or people who are unknown in one way or another. And that has been a huge part of why these conferences have been so successful. Also, of course, there's not just the talks, there's the recreation, there's the informal interactions, as they call it. So, a big part of what I introduced into gerontology conferences was having free alcohol every evening. Made a huge difference.
Yeah.
And other people have copied me on that over the years. But yeah, so that's coming up. Now, the Dublin Longevity Declaration, which it gets its name because it was first launched a year ago at Longevity Summit Dublin in 2023. It's all about getting the word out to the world, to the general public and to policymakers and decision makers, that the expert community now feel quite optimistic about the time frame for bringing aging under medical control. Historically, I've been optimistic and I've been out there making a massive nuisance of myself for a long, long time, but I've been pretty much the only person doing that. I have been able to get into this position where I'm working independently and I'm funded by philanthropy. But all of my colleagues are in this much worse position where they have professorships at universities and they're funded by the government and they have to be terribly politically correct all the time. And so they have been unable, even if they wanted to get out there and say the kinds of things that I say. This started to change in maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when David Sinclair wrote his counterpart to my book. If he'd written a book that was called Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to 10 years earlier, the way I did, he wouldn't be a professor at Harvard anymore. He'd have been fired, right? But there you go. So that's happening now. And we realized that there was great value in demonstrating that this is now the consensus view of the expert community. So it's not just me and David up there on the signatories of this thing. There's more than 100 luminaries from the biology of aging. Most of the top people have signed up to it. And that's huge. It makes all the difference. So of course, it's early days yet. It's been out there for like 8 months, something like that. And so we've got all the expert support that we want. We'd like two other types of support. We'd like support from scientists who are not gerontologists, but who are, really important and really recognized, people who've won Nobel Prizes, that kind of thing, right? And we're working on that. And the other thing is we want the general public. We want people to come out and sign this in large numbers. At the moment, we've only got a couple of thousand signatories from the general public, and that's not nearly good enough. We want a couple of 100,000. And, that's what I'm going to be working to make happen.
Perfect. We will support, and I will link all the links to the show notes. So since we are wrapping up, I don't know how much time you have, but what are your next steps, and how our listeners can support your work or what you are doing in the foundation or work?
Right. So ever since about 2005, I have been supporting research in this area. And of course, the things that I have always chosen to support have been the things that are most neglected by other people. Back then, there were a lot of things that were neglected, and so I had a lot of things to work on. Now, I'm very pleased to say that most of the things that I needed to fund back then have moved forward far enough that they are in the private sector. There are startup companies that are much more well-funded simply because investors tend to write bigger checks than donors do. And so that's all wonderful. But there are some things that remain that are still not working well enough to be investable, and therefore they still need to be supported philanthropically. My previous organization, Sense Research Foundation, is doing a lot of that very good work, not as much as I would like, but it's doing some. And so that's good. But my new organization, LEV Foundation, is doing something that only became possible quite recently. And this is now, I firmly believe, the single most important thing that we need to do, the single thing that will make most impact per dollar. That is combining things that already work. Now, things that already work, first of all, I'm talking about mice. I'm not talking about humans, because that's what I do. I work on early stage stuff. And when I say work, I mean work a little bit. I mean, they give a certain amount of extension of healthy life and total life to mice, even when you start the intervention in middle age. When the mice are maybe 1.5 years old, they would normally live to 2.5. We try to extend that. But nothing gives more than a couple of months of increase in lifespan on its own. So the question is, what can we do if we put a lot of such interventions together in the same mice at the same time? And what we are hoping to achieve, and what we're planning to achieve in the long run anyway, is a whole year of extension. So we take mice that are 1.5 years old, they would normally live to 2.5 on average. We want to get them out to 3.5 on average. And of course, some mice live a bit longer. So the maximum lifespan, typically it's about 9 months longer than the mean lifespan. So they would normally, the maximum would be like 3.25. We want to get it out to like 4.25. Of course, the more the better. If we get more than that, so much the better. But that's where we're starting. And so early last year, we started our first experiment in this area with 4 interventions. Rapamycin is one of them. The other ones are all bona fide damage repair, putting in young stem cells, putting in more telomerase, and also getting rid of senescent cells using a senolytic. And the key thing is we are keen not just to try them all and see what happens, but also to learn as much as we can. So it's a big, big experiment. It's got 1,000 mice, 500 males, 500 females. And that's because there are 10 treatment groups. There's a group that's getting all these interventions. There's, of course, a control group that's not getting any of them. And then there are 4 groups that are getting just one of them, just to validate that we are doing the experiment correctly. And then there are 4 treatment groups that are getting 3 out of the 4 interventions, because those will be the ones that show up antagonistic interactions, where two interventions are somehow cancelling themselves out by mechanisms that we don't understand. So this is going to be a spectacularly informative experiment. And it already is. I mean, the mice are more than 2.5 years old now. And sure enough, it seems to be working. I put out updates regularly on social media and on our website, levf.org. Yeah, it's going well, but maybe not well enough. We want it to go really well. And so this is not the last step here. We're doing this experiment, but we want to start the next experiment of the same kind. The next one we want to do in the same overall design, but we want to use 4 different interventions. One of them will be deuterated fatty acids. One of them will be partial reprogramming, what are called the Yamanaka factors supplied to the mice to make their cells more stem-like. Then we're interested in albumin, which is the most abundant protein in the plasma, in the blood of all mammals. And there is reason to believe that if you put in new albumin, you can get a rejuvenating effect. You get the idea. So the design of this new study is again prominently shown on our website, levf.org. The thing is, though, these studies are damned expensive. They're extremely informative. So when I say they are the most value for money, I really mean it. I really believe that. But the money is a lot. This first experiment cost $3.5 million. And most of that, because it's 1,000 mice, right? It's a lot of mice.
Yeah.
And most of that money had to be spent near the beginning of the experiment, or at the beginning. We had to buy the mice. We had to, and the interventions, because most of the interventions are rejuvenation, they're done once at the beginning, and then you just wait, right? And they're very laborious, replacing, giving 1,000 mice, well, actually 500 mice, a bone marrow transplant, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So the second experiment, it's going to be the same. It's going to cost a lot. It's going to cost a few $1 million. And I am busily trying to raise that right now. So anyone who's listening to this podcast and who is in a position to contribute, then please do. Every little helps. That's really, that's the main goal of now.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. We are wrapping up. I think you are breaking up a little bit, the connection, but we are at the end of our call. I hope there will be a follow-up. I don't know when, but
yeah,
I will link all the details. I will follow you. And then, I know that you post periodically on X or Twitter, or formerly Twitter, updates and on social. And anything else I can do for you?
I think you've covered the main things: the longevity studies that we're doing in mice, the longevity declaration, and of course the longevity summit in Dublin.
Perfect. So thanks again, Aubrey. Thanks again for your time. I really admire your work, and let's keep updated. And I hope to have you again here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Bye for now.
Have a good one. Bye.
Did you like this episode? If so, simply subscribe, thumbs up, and click on the notification bell not to lose any opportunity in the future. And remember, sharing is caring, even for a coffee. Even better. Till next time, see you soon.